Most men believe that when a connection ends, the story is over. Silence means indifference. Distance means she moved on. But psychology doesn't work that simply. There is an emotional phase women rarely admit after a connection ends, and most men never realize it's happening. No messages, no explanations, just silence and hidden emotions moving beneath the surface. The truth is, after a connection ends, many men misunderstand what that silence actually means. And that's exactly why understanding the emotional phase women rarely admit after a connection ends can completely change the way you see relationships. If you're a man who wants to understand female psychology, attraction, and the hidden dynamics of modern relationships, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. We're building a community of men who want clarity instead of confusion, and we're also pushing toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, so join us and be part of it. Topic 1. The silence that confuses most men. Many men have been through this situation even if they've never said it out loud. The connection felt real. The conversations flowed naturally, the laughs came easy, and there was that quiet feeling that something meaningful was building between you two. Then suddenly, silence. No messages, no clear explanation. That's usually the moment when most men reach the same conclusion. She just lost interest. It seems logical, right? But human emotional psychology rarely works in such a simple, straight line. A wise mentor once said that silence, especially after a strong connection, rarely means the absence of emotion. In many cases, it means the exact opposite. Some women enter a kind of emotional pause, not because they felt nothing, but because they felt more than they expected. Think about someone standing too close to a fire. The warmth can feel great, but it can also make them instinctively step back for a moment. Human connections work in a similar way. Sometimes when emotions run deep, the immediate reaction isn't moving closer, it's creating temporary distance. This confuses many men because the male brain often interprets behavior in very direct ways. Interest means presence. Disinterest means distance. But human emotions, especially after a meaningful connection, behave more like waves than straight lines. Sometimes someone needs space to process what they actually felt. And interestingly enough, it's in that quiet space that something begins happening behind the emotional scenes. Something most men never notice, and that leads us directly to the next point. Topic 2. The emotional delay most men don't expect. There's an emotional phenomenon that very few men understand, yet it shows up quite often after a connection ends. Emotional delay. For many men, the frustration or disappointment hits almost immediately. They feel the absence, they notice the shift, and they start processing the situation within the first few days. But for many women, the emotional timeline can look very different. In the beginning, they may seem calm, busy, even unaffected. From the outside, it might look like she simply moved on. But that's not always what's happening internally. A seasoned mentor once explained it in a simple way. Some emotions operate like a letter sent through the mail, not an instant message. At first, she's still busy with her daily routine. Friends, work, responsibilities, distractions. The mind finds quick ways to fill the empty space left by the connection. But weeks later, sometimes even months later, something shifts. Life slows down a bit. The silence becomes noticeable. And that's often when certain memories start coming back with surprising clarity. Sometimes it's triggered by something small, a song that used to play when you talked, a restaurant that reminds her of a long conversation and a night full of laughter, or even a simple habit she used to associate with you. Suddenly, the mind starts connecting dots that once seemed scattered. And if most men could see what's happening behind the emotional curtain at that moment, they'd probably be surprised. Because while they assumed everything had already been forgotten, something is actually being quietly revisited inside her mind, leading to the next stage. Topic 3. The private reflection phase. There's a quiet phase that rarely gets talked about when it comes to relationships, but it happens far more often than people think. Once the initial emotional noise fades and daily life goes back to normal, many women enter a period of private reflection. It's not dramatic, and it's not something they announce to friends or post about online. Quite the opposite. It's a quiet internal process. The mind starts revisiting small moments from the connection, almost like flipping through old pages of a book that hasn't been completely closed yet. During this phase, details that once seemed ordinary begin to take on new meaning. A conversation that felt simple at the time. A moment where she felt understood or emotionally safe. The human brain doesn't just store events, it stores feelings. And when the mind revisits those memories, it's not just remembering what happened, it's briefly re-experiencing how it felt in that moment. An old relationship coach once said something interesting. Connections that leave a mark don't disappear. They reorganize themselves in memory. During this reflection phase, the story starts being viewed from a calmer, more distant perspective. Things that once went unnoticed begin to make more sense. And interestingly, right in the middle of that quiet reflection, another emotion often starts to appear, something that blends curiosity, uncertainty, and a question that rarely gets spoken out loud. Topic 4. When curiosity quietly returns. After some time in that reflection phase, something interesting begins to show up in the human mind. Curiosity. It's not necessarily intense longing or an immediate desire to reconnect. It's something much more subtle. A small question that pops up from time to time, almost like a passing thought. I wonder if he changed or what is he doing these days? This kind of curiosity is far more common than most men realize, yet it's rarely admitted out loud. The human mind has a natural tendency to revisit stories that never felt fully finished. Think about a movie that ends without clearly explaining what happened to an important character. Even days later, that question can still pop into your mind. Emotional connections work in a similar way. When there were genuine moments, mutual respect, or meaningful conversations, the mind tends to keep that person in a small corner of memory. And this is where things get interesting. Sometimes that curiosity leads to almost invisible actions, briefly checking an old profile, remembering a specific conversation, or wondering how that person reacted to the distance. None of this necessarily leads to action right away, because shortly after curiosity appears, another emotional force usually enters the picture. One that's quiet but incredibly powerful: pride. Topic 5. The ego versus emotion conflict. When curiosity starts to surface, another internal battle often begins right afterward, a quiet conflict between emotion and pride. On one side, part of her may feel the urge to understand what really happened, or even revisit that connection with a different level of maturity. But another part of her quickly responds with something like, "No, it's better to leave it in the past." This internal conflict isn't exclusive to women, of course. No human being enjoys feeling emotionally vulnerable after something ends. An experienced mentor once described this with a simple analogy. Imagine two voices sitting at the same table. One voice represents emotion, remembering the good moments, the easy conversations, the rare sense of genuine connection. The other voice represents ego, reminding her of the risks, the possibility of looking weak, or showing that there might still be some lingering feelings. And as you can imagine, those two voices rarely reach an agreement quickly. Sometimes this internal debate happens so quietly that nobody around her even realizes it's happening. That's why many men misinterpret certain behaviors during this phase. They assume the lack of action means the lack of feeling, when in reality it may mean the exact opposite. And even when this internal conflict seems settled, life moving forward normally again, small emotional triggers can still bring those feelings back when least expected. Topic 6. The unexpected nostalgia trigger. Even when it seems like everything has been left in the past, the human mind has a strange way of bringing emotions back, often in the most unexpected moments. This is what many people call a nostalgia trigger. It can happen on an ordinary day. Maybe she's driving to work, listening to a random playlist, when suddenly a specific song starts playing. And without warning, a memory appears. It's not dramatic. It's more like a quick mental snapshot. But it leaves behind a feeling that's hard to explain. Emotional memory works much more through association than through logic. A place, a smell, an inside joke. Even a simple Sunday coffee can suddenly bring back memories of a connection that once seemed forgotten. A relationship mentor once compared it to old boxers stored in the attic. You might go months without thinking about them, but open one for just a few seconds, and the memories come back with surprising clarity. Interestingly, many of those memories don't only carry sadness. Sometimes they carry admiration, appreciation, or even a quiet smile. Topic 7. The silent comparison phase. At some point, life moves forward. New people appear. New conversations start. New dates happen. From the outside, it looks like a completely normal part of life. The human brain has a habit that operates almost automatically: comparison. It's not something people consciously decide to do. It simply happens. When someone has experienced a connection that truly left an impression, the brain naturally uses that experience as a reference point for future interactions. Sometimes the comparison appears in subtle ways. Maybe a new date is pleasant, the conversation flows, but something feels different. Not necessarily worse, just different. Maybe it's the sense of humor, the way someone listens, or that rare feeling of comfort that once existed without effort. A mentor once said that certain connections create an invisible standard in the mind. After experiencing that level of connection, the memory continues to use it as a quiet reference point moving forward. Topic 8. The phase of unspoken respect. As time passes, something interesting begins to happen in emotional memory. Perspective changes. When two people are close, small frustrations, expectations, or misunderstandings can take up a lot of mental space. But when enough time passes, the mind starts reorganizing the story in a more balanced way. Moments that once felt ordinary begin to appear more meaningful. An experienced relationship mentor once said that time works like a lens that slowly refocuses memories. With emotional distance, certain qualities begin to stand out more clearly. Maybe it was the way he handled problems, the calmness during a difficult conversation, or the rare ability to listen without turning everything into conflict. These things might have seemed normal at the time, but when compared with other experiences later in life, they can start to carry a different kind of weight. Topic 9. The moment she almost reaches out. There's a moment that very few people admit, but it happens far more often than you'd expect. At some point during this emotional process, after the memories, the comparisons, and that quiet respect that begins to grow, a simple thought can appear. Maybe I should send him a message. It doesn't necessarily mean she wants to restart the relationship. Sometimes it's just curiosity. Sometimes it's a genuine desire to know how that person is doing. This moment can happen during something completely ordinary. Maybe she sees something that reminds her of an old conversation, or hears someone mention a topic you two used to talk about for hours. For a few seconds, the distance between the thought and the action becomes very small. Topic 10. The truth most women never say out loud. There's a quiet truth about human connections that rarely gets said out loud. Not every connection disappears completely. Some simply change their place in memory. They stop being part of everyday life. They stop appearing in messages or daily conversations. But they still exist somewhere inside the emotional landscape of a person's life. A wise mentor once said that some people enter our lives as temporary visitors, but end up becoming permanent chapters in our story. It doesn't mean the relationship needed to last forever. It doesn't mean someone is stuck in the past. It simply means that some connections were real enough to leave a genuine mark. When something is real, the mind doesn't erase it. It archives it. Conclusion. In the end, understanding the psychology behind these phases isn't about trying to control someone or predict every thought a woman might have. It's about seeing relationships with more maturity, more clarity, and far less emotional confusion. When a man understands that silence doesn't always mean indifference, he stops reacting impulsively and starts responding with emotional intelligence. And interestingly enough, that calm, grounded attitude often says far more about a man than any desperate attempt to hold on to a connection. Now think about your own experiences for a moment. Have you ever interpreted someone's silence as rejection, only to realize later that the situation might have been more complicated than it seemed? Or have you ever experienced a connection that appeared to end, but somehow stayed in your memory far longer than expected? If content like this helps you see relationships from a deeper and more strategic perspective, then this channel is for you. Here we explore the psychology of attraction, human behavior, and modern relationship dynamics in a clear and honest way. So go ahead, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning the things most people never notice about human psychology and relationships.